What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
This changed my life in just 30 days, and I swear I never thought I would be the kind of woman who needed to get a lawyer just to deal with her own parents. But here I am, telling you exactly why that became the only option left. For years, I had played the role of the reliable daughter, the one who could be counted on to fill the gap whenever bills came up short, whenever my sister hit another wall, or whenever my parents decided that family meant my paycheck was automatically everyone's safety net. At first it seemed harmless, even normal, because I told myself that helping them was just what good daughters did, and besides, they would remember it when I needed them. Except that moment never came, and the requests only grew louder and more entitled. I can still remember the first big loan I gave them. They called it a loan, but no one ever intended to pay it back. It was for Lily's car that had broken down, and I wired the money within the hour because I thought if she lost her job, it would spiral into something worse. My mother told me I was saving the whole family by stepping in. She said, "We all do our part, and right now your part is money." That stuck in my head for years, like it was some sacred family rule. Every time another bill came, every time a deductible popped up, or every time rent was late, I stepped in. Thousands and thousands over the years, and not once did anyone ask if I was okay carrying all that weight. Daniel, back when we were dating, never judged me, but he would ask quiet questions like, "When do they plan on paying you back?" or "Do you even want to be doing this?" At first, I brushed him off, because admitting the truth meant admitting I had been manipulated for years. It was easier to pretend that this was just normal family life. But eventually, even I couldn't deny how twisted it had become. I would come home exhausted from work, only to find 3 missed calls from my mom, each one a variation of "Call me back right now, it's urgent." Half the time, the so-called emergency was that Lily wanted to go back to school and needed a deposit, or that some bill had to be covered by midnight. They had trained me to believe that if I didn't jump, I was abandoning them. The turning point came when my friend Maya visited and overheard one of those calls. She sat there listening to me promise another transfer, and then said, flat out, "Emily, you're not a daughter to them anymore. You're a debit card." That was the first time anyone had said it so plainly, and it hit me like a slap. She followed it up with something that stuck even harder. "If you want them to stop, you don't beg, you don't explain, you build a wall." At the time, it sounded cold, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was the only way I would survive this pattern. Daniel and I met with a lawyer named Aisha. She was calm, no nonsense, and told me something I will never forget. Love is not a contract, but money should be. That single sentence reframed my whole life. She walked me through setting up new accounts, closing old ones, and creating simple loan agreements for all the so-called gifts I had already given. She explained that I wasn't punishing my parents or my sister, I was just drawing lines they had erased years ago. For the first time, I felt like I had a path that didn't involve constant guilt. The notary appointment was surreal. My parents signed paperwork they barely read because they assumed it was just formality for my upcoming marriage. My mother made comments about how Daniel was probably making me do all this, as if I couldn't possibly want to protect myself. I let her think that if it kept the peace, because the real satisfaction was knowing that from that moment forward, every dollar I had ever handed them was documented as a loan, and any future request had to go through Aisha. Daniel and I also set up a bank account that required both of our approvals for anything significant. It was boring, it was clinical, and it was the most freeing thing I had ever done. No more panic calls that could drain my savings in an instant. No more watching my balance collapse after years of sacrifice. I had finally taken the first step to break the cycle. The first test came quicker than I expected. My mom called me one evening and said Lily needed money for a new apartment because her landlord was raising the rent. I told her I couldn't just transfer money like before. She got sharp, accusing me of being selfish now that I was with Daniel. I repeated myself, "Send the request to my attorney." Silence on the other end. Then a hiss of disbelief, like I had spoken in another language. She said, "You would really make your own mother go through a lawyer?" And I answered, "Yes, because that's the only way this works from now on." In that moment, I felt something I had never felt with my family before: control. For once, I wasn't begging them to see my side. I wasn't drowning in guilt, and I wasn't losing money I would never see again. I had flipped the script without raising my voice. And here's the part that made me laugh later, even through the stress. The lawyer wasn't even on the phone, wasn't standing in my living room, and yet just saying her name changed everything. It was like introducing a referee into a game they had been winning for years. They had no idea how to play now that the rules had shifted. The call ended with my mother furious and me shaking, but not with fear, with relief. Because for the first time in years, I had not given in. I had not wired a cent. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. By the time I hung up, I realized something important. Once you stop being the family's emergency fund, you don't just change the money, you change the power. And that shift, as small as it seemed, was going to reshape everything leading up to my wedding. The next time my mom came calling, I already knew the answer. Send it to my attorney. The week before the wedding did not feel like celebration in the way people describe it at bridal showers or in glossy posts, because every errand and every call seemed to arrive with a thin film of strategy from my mother, who had learned over the years that money moves fastest when it is wrapped in urgency and guilt, and who clearly believed that the more chaotic the week became, the more likely I would let something slip back to the old way where I said yes first and dealt with the wreckage later. I had prepared for chaos with boring tools that never trend on social media, tools like 2 signature approvals on the primary account, escrow releases for vendors tied to finished work rather than promises, and a standing instruction that any request for personal funds, whether called a loan or a gift or an emergency, would pass through Aisha's office before it touched my phone, and although it looked unromantic on paper, it turned out to be the one thing that allowed me to sleep through the night without staring at my balance. My mother opened her campaign with concern dressed as love, telling me that Lily had been turned down for a lease because her credit score had nosedived after another round of late payments, and that the humane thing, the sisterly thing, the thing that proved I was not becoming cold since meeting Daniel, would be to divert the honeymoon fund to get Lily into a place near work, because living far away would add hours to her commute and that strain would break her. She had clearly rehearsed each angle, because when I answered that we had already committed those funds to a prepaid itinerary with non-refundable milestones, she pivoted to say that love is measured by what you are willing to lose, and that no trip mattered as much as family stability, and when I reminded her that there was now a formal support path through the trust that would cover a deposit if Lily completed a counseling intake and a block of job search hours, she called it punitive and cold, and asked why I could not just wire it like I used to, because the landlord would not wait for paperwork. What I did next felt small and huge at the same time, because I did not argue and I did not try to persuade her, since years of trying had never changed a single outcome, and instead I repeated the same sentence with a steady voice that surprised even me, telling her to send the request to my attorney, adding that if the situation was as urgent as she believed, the documentation would be quick and the first disbursement could be routed straight to the landlord, which would actually protect Lily from late fees and protect me from the familiar pattern where my money disappeared into a general pool that never reached its stated purpose. She tried to shame me by saying that no one wants lawyers involved in family matters, which is a way of saying the only rules that count are the ones she writes, and I said that I want clarity and that clarity keeps relationships alive. And then I ended the call before we slid into the swamp where I explain and she denies and hours pass with nothing. Decided except that I will pay. That afternoon a vendor texted to confirm final delivery windows and asked for the last authorization code, and because we had placed all vendors inside a simple escrow with release conditions, I did not have to juggle a dozen invoices or rely on whoever sounded the most panicked, and I simply forwarded the code from the bank, which had been pre-approved by both me and Daniel, and watched the dashboard update from pending to scheduled, which is a terribly dull thing to describe, and yet it was the first time in years that paying for something big did not come with a secondary storm. Later I learned that my mother had called that same vendor and offered to take over the payment on our behalf as a gesture of support, which would have sounded generous to anyone who did not understand how control hooks itself to money in my family. And the vendor replied, politely and firmly, that he could accept only the authorization linked to the contract, which meant my mother discovered the hard way that her usual workarounds were no longer welcome on the playing field. In the middle of this, Daniel kept his voice soft and his questions simple, asking whether I wanted him to take the next round of vendor calls so I could breathe, and reminding me that every system we had set up was working exactly as designed. Because healthy systems do not stop someone from asking for what they want, they stop that request from stepping over your threshold without your consent. Maya checked in from across town and told me that if I made it through the week without breaking the new rules for even 1 hour, the habit would set like concrete, and that one day soon the sound of my mother's ringtone would not send an adrenaline wave across my chest. And I decided to believe her even though my hands were still shaking after every conversation. That night, when I reviewed the emails that Aisha's paralegal had forwarded, I saw the formal intake for Lily's support waiting untouched, and I felt a tug of old panic because the clock was ticking on her lease application. And a part of me wanted to call her and walk her through every step and maybe even finish the forms for her as I had done 100 times before. Yet another part of me, the part that was finally tired of playing rescuer, understood that the whole point of the new structure was to return responsibility to the person who owned the problem, and that any relief I provided outside the structure would prove my mother right that I did not mean what I said. So I wrote Lily a long, kind message explaining that the trust would pay the deposit directly once she scheduled the counseling intake and logged the job search hours, that I believed she could do it, and that I would be cheering for her from the sidelines, not carrying her over the line, and then I turned off my phone and sat with the discomfort until it loosened its grip. The next morning my mother arrived at our apartment with a folder and a practiced smile that said she intended to be helpful while also making it clear that only her definition of helpful would count, and she announced that since vendors can be flaky, she had negotiated a better rate on a floral package if we paid cash, which would require me to unlock the account and transfer a lump sum to her, and she held out the folder like a magician inviting the audience to inspect the hat, and I listened without interrupting until she finished her pitch, and then I told her that our contracts were set, our payments were scheduled, and nothing about our plan would change because nothing needed fixing. She shifted to a colder tone and said that a real family would make sure Lily had a roof before anyone paid for flowers, and I replied that Lily had a clear, funded path to that roof, one that bypassed guilt and confusion and put the money where it was supposed to go, and that if she wanted to help her daughter, she could help her start the intake today. When she realized persuasion was failing, she reached for my phone, the old move she had used when I was younger and too startled to resist, and her fingers were on the case before I even understood what was happening. And then Daniel stepped between us in a way that was gentle and unyielding at once, saying that no one would be touching my phone today, that boundaries were not a debate item, and that all financial questions would be answered in writing through the attorney, and my mother stared at him with disbelief, as if a polite sentence could be an act of betrayal. She left with a brisk promise to handle this another way, which used to scare me because another way always meant escalation. Yet this time it did not scare me because the only ways available now were written, traceable, and boring was our friend. By the end of that day, the vendors had their codes, the escrow dashboard was clean, the trust paperwork for Lily remained untouched but available, and the silence from my parents began to feel less like a storm building and more like people pacing against a locked door. And I understood that the real test would not be the calls or the offers or the attempts to swap in a new pair, because the real test would be the moment they decided to grab rather than ask, which had always been the moment I surrendered in the past and would not be this time, not with the systems humming and the rules written and the habit of saying send it to my attorney finally living in my mouth like muscle memory. Tomorrow would be the rehearsal dinner, and then the ceremony, and I had a feeling my mother would try to turn a toast into a demand or a blessing into a transaction, but for the first time I was not dreading the scene. Because the next time she reached for money that was not hers, there would be no explanation and no argument, only a sealed envelope in Daniel's hand and a line that could not be crossed without consequences. The morning of the wedding should have been filled with nerves about vows, last-minute details, and the surreal realization that my life was about to merge with someone I truly trusted. Yet instead, I woke up knowing that the real storm would not come from the schedule or the guests, but from my own parents, who had spent years perfecting the art of turning every milestone into a negotiation for money. Daniel had warned me to expect something dramatic, because patterns do not die quietly, and my gut told me that they would not let the day pass without one last grab, dressed up as family necessity. By then I had rehearsed the new boundaries so many times that the words felt natural, but there was still a part of me that remembered the years when I folded at the first sign of tension. And I kept asking myself whether I was strong enough to hold the line when the spotlight of my own wedding day made me most vulnerable. I did not have to wait long for the answer, because just an hour before the ceremony, when I should have been adjusting my hair and calming my nerves, my mother cornered me in the hallway outside the bridal suite. Her voice was steady, but the words landed like a verdict. "We are taking your money, because your sister is struggling more, and this is what you owe to family." She did not ask, she did not plead, she simply declared it, as though I had no voice at all, and when I froze in disbelief, she reached toward my phone, the old reflex she had used since I was young. Confident that if she could just touch the device she could move the funds herself before I regained control. It was a script she had run 100 times, and every other time I had stood stunned until it was too late. But this time Daniel was ready, and without raising his voice or showing even a flicker of anger, he stepped forward and placed a sealed envelope directly into her hand, saying only, "This is exactly why we set things up differently." His calmness was sharper than shouting, because it made clear that none of this was spontaneous. We had anticipated it, we had prepared for it, and the outcome had already been decided long before she thought to stage her ambush. My mother blinked, thrown off balance by his composure, and for the first time I saw hesitation flicker across her face, because she was holding an envelope that she had not expected, a letter that carried weight she could feel even before reading a word. She opened it with quick, clipped movements, as though speed could dilute the impact, and as her eyes moved across the page, I saw the flush rise on her cheeks. The realization setting in that the financial leash she thought she still held had been severed long ago and replaced with a legal structure that left her without access, without leverage, and without the ability to twist my love into debt. She tried to hand it to my father, as though his approval could rewrite it, but his expression fell as he read the first paragraph, and even he, the man who usually mumbled agreement with whatever she wanted, seemed suddenly older, quieter, and aware that the balance of power had shifted permanently. Lily, standing nearby, rolled her eyes at first and muttered that we were being dramatic, but when she glanced over her father's shoulder and caught the part about the trust set up in her name, funded, structured, and entirely out of our parents' hands, her smirk faded. For once she understood that this was not just about me refusing to hand over money, it was about her being forced to step up without her usual safety net of manipulation. She looked confused, half angry and half uncertain, because the escape hatch she had relied on for years was no longer accessible, yet in that confusion I sensed something else, a faint recognition that maybe this was what she needed, even if she could not admit it out loud. The hallway was silent except for the faint music drifting from the ceremony space, and in that pause my mother tried one last line, her voice brittle, but still commanding, "You would not dare to treat your own family like this." And I answered, steady and unflinching, "I already did, and I am not turning back." My words hung in the air heavier than any decoration or vow, because for the first time I was not defending or apologizing, I was stating fact, and there was nothing left for them to argue. Daniel touched my hand, grounding me, and we walked toward the ceremony as if nothing had happened, even though the ground beneath my family had shifted forever. Guests were taking their seats, smiling and chatting, oblivious to the battle that had just played out a few doors away, and that was the moment I understood the brilliance of the plan. The war had ended before the music even started, and the letter had done what years of pleading never could. As I stepped into the aisle, I caught sight of my parents standing stiffly, their faces tight with the knowledge that their usual tactics had failed, and for once I did not feel guilty about it. I felt free. Every step toward Daniel was not just a step toward marriage, but a step away from decades of manipulation, and I could almost hear Maya's voice in my head telling me that the habit had set, that the wall was built, and that no amount of guilt could tear it down now. I knew the letter held more than they had read in those frantic moments, that it spelled out the consequences of coercion, the repayment clauses on past gifts, and the airtight conditions of the trust. But I also knew this was not the moment to reveal every detail. The point was never to humiliate them. The point was to end the cycle, to reclaim my life, and to show them that I would not be bullied into funding their choices any longer. They now had a choice of their own: accept the new rules and remain in my life on equal terms, or keep fighting a battle that was already lost. As the music swelled and I reached Daniel's side, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm, because the hardest confrontation of the day was already behind me, and for once it had ended not with my bank account drained, but with my dignity intact. The ceremony began, but in my mind one sentence kept replaying, not as a question but as a promise. I had dared, and I had won. The reception began with the kind of polite laughter and clinking glasses that people rely on when they do not know what else to say, and while I smiled at the right moments and thanked the guests who had traveled across states to be with us, I could feel another kind of energy moving through the room, a quiet ripple that always follows my mother when a plan has been interrupted and a new story must be installed before anyone begins to ask questions that cannot be managed with charm alone, and I sensed that the story she wanted to spread would cast me as ungrateful and Daniel as controlling, because that is the script that works when money stops responding to familiar hands. I watched the cousins cluster near the bar where she liked to hold court, and I recognized the subtle choreography of someone who has turned narrative management into an art form, with the wounded tone you use when you want sympathy without facts, and the practice side that implies harm without naming any concrete harm at all, and the quiet suggestion that a new husband is the reason a daughter suddenly becomes distant, which is another way of saying the daughter finally grew a spine and someone needs to be blamed for it who is not her. Instead of chasing every whisper and trying to swat down every floating rumor like an anxious security guard, I chose the opposite approach, because I have learned that nothing weakens gossip faster than calm documentation. And the only way to extract myself from years of emotional accounting is to stay relentlessly boring when the other side wants a spectacle. So I walked to a quieter table where Mr. Collins had been kind enough to attend as a family friend and not as a bank functionary, and I asked him whether he would be comfortable, if anyone asked, confirming a single simple point with no details and no numbers. Namely that the account Daniel and I use for significant payments requires 2 approvals, and that this practice is routine for couples who want protection from fraud or pressure. And he nodded in that respectful way that professionals have when they know they are being enlisted not to take sides, but to remind the room that normal safeguards exist in the world and that sensible adults use them without drama. Later, when a cousin who has a talent for stirring quietly repeated the line that Daniel had locked me down financially, I said, with a steady voice that I hardly recognized as mine because it carried no pleading and no heat, that we had chosen simple guardrails months ago so that wedding payments and any future big decisions would be executed with clarity rather than adrenaline, and that a system which requires 2 approvals protects both people by ensuring no one is set up as a villain or a victim each time money moves, which is something I wish I had understood years earlier before I trained my parents to believe that my love could be measured in the speed of my transfers. I did not ask the cousin to believe me, because belief is not required when the paperwork stands on its own, and I did not turn it into a speech, because speeches are invitations to debate, and I was done debating. Maya found me near the dessert table and told me quietly that the whispers were losing traction, because too many people now understood that there were contracts and codes and escrow releases, and that none of those things sounded like cruelty. They sounded like adulthood, and she suggested one more step that would feel both generous and firm, which is the exact balance I wanted on this day, and she said that since Lily had not finished her intake forms, I could authorize the trust to send a first month's deposit directly to the landlord as a conditional advance, with the conditions spelled out in plain language that counseling intake and job search logs must be submitted within a set window for the support to continue. not to punish her but to give her dignity while keeping the old channels closed to people who had abused them. It felt right, not as a capitulation but as a statement of principle, because the point was never to starve Lily of help, it was to starve the addiction to leverage that had defined our family's idea of love. I stepped into a quiet corner and called Aisha, who had anticipated a moment like this and had the language ready, and within minutes her paralegal sent a clean, courteous message to the landlord offering the deposit directly from the trust with a confirmation that release of subsequent months depended on completed steps that Lily alone could fulfill, which meant that the help moved fast without passing through my mother's hands, and that accountability belonged to the person who needed the apartment rather than the person who loves playing treasurer of other people's money. That single action felt like oxygen, because for the first time help did not arrive wrapped in shame or control, and anyone who tried to weaponize the story would now have to confront the dull fact that money had gone exactly where the problem lived. With that done, I asked Aisha for one more tool, a message we had drafted weeks earlier that I had hoped never to use, a plain wedding day statement written in friendly language that explained, without accusation, that we had chosen protective financial structures so the day could unfold without last-minute emergencies, that ongoing support for Lily would flow through a trust built to protect her directly, and that all vendor arrangements would remain as contracted, with no substitutions or side payments needed, and she sent it to a small list of relatives who had already been pulled into side conversations, and I watched the temperature in the room drop by a few degrees as the oxygen left the rumor machine. My mother tried a final pivot by suggesting to a sympathetic aunt that Daniel had embarrassed her by handing over a letter like a courtroom summons, and I simply said that the letter existed because years of conversations had gone nowhere, and because our wedding day deserved clarity rather than negotiation, and that if anyone felt uncomfortable, they could choose not to stand between a couple and the boundaries that keep them healthy, which is a longer way of saying that if respect feels like an insult, you have lived too long without it. I did not raise my voice, I did not ask for understanding, and I certainly did not apologize for protecting the life I was building, because the years of apologizing had cost me more than any vendor contract ever would. By the last dance the tables had thinned, the whispers had faded into ordinary chatter about travel plans and childcare, and the only people still bristling were the ones invested in the old system where I paid to keep the peace, while everyone else called it love. And I understood with a clarity that felt almost like relief that my job now was not to win over the holdouts, but to keep the channels clean and the rules visible, because structure, when it is honest, does not beg to be liked, it simply holds. As we gathered our things and thanked the staff and walked toward the exit, where the night air felt like a border between the life I had been living and the one I was choosing, my phone buzzed with a message from Aisha confirming that the landlord had accepted the deposit and that Lily had the intake link in her inbox, and for the first time in years I felt the strange joy of solving a family crisis without feeding the family disease. I should have felt finished, and yet I knew there was one last step that could not be skipped, because events like this have an aftershock where people test the fence to see if it was real or just good theater. And the morning after a wedding is when those tests usually come dressed as fragile apologies or blistering ultimatums or sudden emergencies that demand instant decisions. So before we turned in for the night, I asked Daniel to remind me where the sealed copies of our documents were, and he smiled and tapped the inside pocket of the jacket he had draped across my shoulders, and I realized that the next move was not a speech or a confrontation. It was the quiet unveiling of everything the letter actually contained, which meant that tomorrow, when the sun came up and the phones lit again, I would no longer hint or reassure or negotiate, because the final move had already been written, signed, and waiting for the moment when it would be read aloud. The morning after the wedding carried the heavy quiet that follows a storm which never quite broke in the open, and although guests had left with smiles and photos, and the vendors had confirmed that everything had been delivered exactly as agreed, I knew that my parents were not finished, because people who have relied on control for decades do not surrender after one letter, no matter how cleanly it is written. Daniel and I sat together at a small brunch arranged for a handful of close friends, and even there I felt the weight of expectation in the room. as though everyone was waiting to see whether the confrontation that had hung over the ceremony would reappear in daylight with more witnesses. My parents walked in looking rehearsed, as if they had practiced their expressions in the mirror, my father trying for neutrality, and my mother holding herself stiff with dignity that seemed to be crumbling at the edges, while Lily kept her head down in a way that suggested she was calculating how the new order might change her daily reality. I had decided long before that I would not spend the first day of my marriage defending myself with explanations that only led to circular arguments, and that the only thing left to do was to reveal, calmly and directly, the contents of the letter they had only skimmed in panic the day before. I stood, asked for everyone's attention, and said that since rumors had already begun to circulate, it was better to put the facts on the table so no one would leave with questions that could be twisted into new versions of the story. My voice shook at first, but steadied as I unfolded the copy of the letter and began to read aloud, not with drama, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that comes when you finally refuse to let your own history be edited by someone else. The letter opened with a simple statement that every transfer I had made over the years, every so-called gift or rescue or loan, had been formally documented with signatures that converted them into interest-free loans, and that those loans carried an acceleration clause which activated if coercion or manipulation was attempted. This meant that the moment my mother declared she would take my money on my wedding day, the repayment clock began, and the funds that had been considered lost were no longer favors to be forgotten, but debts that would follow the ordinary rules of accountability. My father swallowed hard as I read that part, because even he could see that it meant the past could not be rewritten anymore, and that the record now belonged to paper instead of memory. The next section explained the restricted trust established for Lily, funded with money that had once been casually demanded from me, but was now locked under conditions that only she could meet, documented counseling intake, verified job search hours, and direct payment to landlords or service providers rather than cash passed through parental hands. I read that the trust was built not to punish her but to make sure support actually solved problems rather than prolonging them, and I saw her lift her head slightly at that line, her face betraying a flicker of recognition that this was an opportunity she could claim if she chose, though pride and habit would make it hard to accept at first. The letter went on to specify that any attempt to override vendor contracts, interfere with bank authorizations, or substitute themselves as payers on obligations tied to me or Daniel would trigger liability for damages, backed by a bond already filed with the bank. I emphasized that this clause was not symbolic but enforceable, and that we had taken the extraordinary step of preparing a crime report for potential financial abuse, which remained sealed unless further coercion occurred, meaning that forgiveness was still available if respect was shown, but escalation would carry consequences beyond family drama. For the first time in my life, the rules were not mine alone to enforce. They lived in institutions and documents that could not be gaslit or ignored. As I finished reading, the room was thick with silence, not the silence of confusion, but the silence that falls when people realize the game has ended and the board has been cleared. My mother tried to regain her footing with a tight smile and the words, "This is unnecessary. We are family. We do not need lawyers between us," but I interrupted her for the first time in years, saying that lawyers became necessary only after years of boundaries were ignored, and that if she wanted to be in my life moving forward, it would be as my mother, not as my creditor, not as my manager, and certainly not as my judge. My father said nothing, his shoulders slumped as though he had finally admitted to himself what he had always known, that his silence had not been neutrality but complicity. Lily's reaction was the most complex. She muttered that this was humiliating, that I had made her look like a child in front of everyone, yet when I reminded her that the trust was in her name alone, and that no one else could touch it, she hesitated, and the room saw the hesitation too, which meant the narrative of cruelty could not survive. If she chose to accept the structure, she would be stepping into a version of adulthood that had never been offered to her before, and if she rejected it, she would have to own the consequences without hiding behind our parents. When it became clear that no one had a rebuttal, I folded the letter, placed it back in its envelope, and said simply that this was the last conversation about money we would ever have outside the attorney's office. I told them they could decide whether they wanted to keep testing fences that would not move, or whether they wanted to walk with me into a relationship defined by respect and not by extraction. Then I sat down, poured myself a cup of coffee, and turned to Daniel, who smiled in that quiet way that reminded me why I had chosen him, not because he saved me, but because he built a life with me where saving myself was finally possible. The brunch ended without theatrics, with relatives murmuring polite goodbyes, some glancing back at my parents with discomfort, others quietly congratulating me in ways that went beyond the marriage. My mother left with a face that could curdle milk, my father trailing after her, and Lily hanging back for a moment before saying she would think about the trust, which was more than I had expected. As Daniel and I walked out into the sunlight, I felt the strange peace of knowing that the most dangerous story my family had ever told about me, that my worth existed only in what I could provide, had finally been dismantled, not with shouting, not with begging, but with the quiet weight of a letter read aloud at the right moment. I cannot claim that everything was resolved, because people who build their lives on entitlement do not transform overnight, but I can say with certainty that I had finally shifted the balance in a way that could not be undone, and that the first day of my marriage began not under the shadow of obligation, but under the clear sky of independence. The victory was not flashy, it was not cruel, and it was not dramatic. It was precise, it was earned, and it was final. And as I looked at Daniel, I knew that the rest of our life together would not be lived as the bank of last resort, but as two people who had finally learned that love does not have to mean surrender, and that respect is worth more than any transfer could ever buy.